All right, everyone, get ready because today we're going deep on some geopolitical predictions from Krzysztof Jackowski, a Polish clairvoyant with a huge following over on YouTube.
Mm.
You sent us his transcript from one of his recent live streams, and wow, there are some really interesting insights about the future in here, particularly for Poland.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how much he focuses on Poland's relationship with both the U.S. and Russia. He's really tapping into those anxieties around all the global power shifts that seem to be happening right now.
Totally. So before we get into the specifics of what he's actually predicting, can we back up for a second, just, understand who Jakowski is and why so many people seem to listen to what he has to say?
Absolutely. I mean, Jakowski's a pretty well-known figure in Poland, particularly on YouTube, where he regularly shares his visions. And while clairvoyance obviously, invites some skepticism, I think what's really interesting is how his predictions, whether or not they actually come true, tend to reflect these deeper anxieties and perspectives within Polish society.
It's almost like he's holding up a mirror to a certain part of the Polish population.
Actually, and in this particular live stream, one of the most startling claims he makes is that the Trump administration is engaging in what he calls psychological warfare against Polish politicians. And he even uses Elon Musk's criticism of the Polish foreign minister Radosław Sikorski as an example, specifically pointing to a tweet where Musk called Sikorski a Soros puppet.
Oh, okay, hold on. I can already picture some of our listeners being like, wait, what? Can we just break down some of those terms a little? I
Yeah.
mean, psychological warfare and Soros puppet are pretty loaded phrases.
You're absolutely right. Let's unpack that a bit. So in this context, psychological warfare refers to tactics that are used to kind of influence public opinion and behavior through things like propaganda, misinformation, or even intimidation. And the Soros puppet accusation is a common trope you see used by certain political groups, and they use it to discredit their opponents by linking them to George Soros, who's this billionaire philanthropist who
Yeah.
often supports, liberal causes.
So basically what Jakowski is saying is that Musk, and maybe even with the backing of the Trump administration, is deliberately trying to undermine Sikorski and by extension kind of undermine Poland's stance on certain issues.
Exactly. And the issue that seems to be at the heart of this alleged warfare is Ukraine. Jakowski believes that the U.S. is pressuring Poland to lessen its support for Ukraine, maybe to appease Russia or to further some hidden U.S. agenda.
So Jakowski is painting this picture of Poland being stuck in this balancing act, trying to support Ukraine, while also managing all this pressure from the U.S. But he doesn't stop there, right? He goes on to say that Trump might actually be willing to use Poland as a bargaining chip in negotiations with Russia, even going as far as to say that Trump could break Poland. I mean, that's a pretty intense statement.
It is, and to really grasp the weight of that statement, I think we need to consider Poland's history, especially its experience of constantly being caught between these powerful empires. The idea of being broken or being used as a pawn really evokes some deep anxieties within the Polish psyche.
It also makes you wonder about the U.S.'s commitment to its allies, particularly in Eastern Europe. If Jakowski's vision is resonating with a significant portion of the Polish population, it suggests a growing sense of unease about America's reliability as a partner.
That's a really sharp observation. And to kind of add fuel to that fire, Jakowski brings up Act 447, which is a U.S. law regarding Holocaust restitution. He suggests that Trump might actually use this act to extract concessions from Poland, which adds another layer to this feeling of being exploited by a more powerful ally.
Can you give us a little more context on Act 447? I'm sure some of our listeners might not be familiar with it and what it means.
Sure. So Act 447 basically calls on the U.S. State Department to report on the progress of certain European countries, including Poland, in returning property that was confiscated during the Holocaust era. It's a very sensitive topic that has caused some tension between Poland and the U.S. Jakowski seems to believe that it could be used as leverage against Poland in this, geopolitical chess game.
So we're starting to see a picture emerge where Poland is feeling pressured, even threatened by both the U.S. and Russia. It's like they're trapped between a rock and a hard place with their very sovereignty hanging in the balance. But Jakowski doesn't just paint a picture of, doom and gloom, does he? He also offers a way forward, a path to strength in the face of all these external threats.
That's right. And this is where he starts to talk about Polish patriotism and self-reliance.
Mm.
He even criticizes what he sees as people mocking patriotism in Polish media. And he suggests that a really strong national identity is crucial for survival in a world that is this turbulent.
He seems to be urging Poland to reject both pro-European and pro-American factions, arguing that neither side can truly protect Poland's interests. It's like he's calling for a renewed sense of national unity, a kind of inward-looking strength to face whatever challenges lie ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this message is likely to resonate with those who feel disillusioned by both the EU and the US, those who believe that Poland needs to forge its own path, independent of any external alliances. But it's also a message with a lot of complexities, as we'll continue to explore in this deep dive.
It's interesting how Jackowski keeps using this language like, Poland being broken or being used as a bargaining chip. I mean, it really does give this sense of powerlessness, like Poland just has no control over what happens to it.
Yeah, that's definitely a big theme running through his predictions. It almost feels like he thinks Poland doesn't really have any say in its own future, which probably, taps into this very real anxiety for a nation that has so often been at the mercy of its much stronger neighbors.
Right, like no matter which way Poland turns towards the EU or the US, it's still going to get, manipulated by these global powers. But I mean, hasn't Poland shown that it can be pretty resilient? I mean, look at the role they're playing in the EU and their support for Ukraine, even with all the pressure they're facing.
That's a good point. Maybe Tchaikovsky's kind of missing the fact that Poland can actually act strategically and, figure out how to navigate this complex geopolitical situation. But then again, his focus on self-reliance could also be his way of acknowledging that Poland needs to be ready to, stand up for itself no matter what kind of pressure it's facing.
So it's a call for self-reliance, but it's also like a warning. It's like he's saying, Poland, wake up. You need to be ready to act independently and decisively.
Yeah, and that sense of urgency might be tied to his very pessimistic view of America's place in the world. Remember, he claims that America has lost the war with Russia. He's basically saying that the U.S. is retreating as a global leader and abandoning its allies.
Okay, that lost war statement is pretty wild. He's saying that both Biden and Trump have essentially conceded defeat to Russia. I mean, how does he back that up?
Well, he doesn't really offer any hard evidence. He more points to the perceived shift in U.S. foreign policy, suggesting that America is looking for new partnerships maybe in Asia for economic and strategic reasons. And then he uses this very vivid metaphor of crocodiles on the loose to describe how Russia might take advantage of this, power vacuum in Europe.
Whoa, okay, that image is intense. It's like tapping into that deep-seated fear of predatory forces taking over. Do you think this resonates with how Poland views Russia historically?
Oh, absolutely. It brings up all those memories of past conflicts and occupations, reminding people of the very real threat that Russia poses to Poland's sovereignty. And this historical context just amplifies the anxieties behind Jackowski's predictions, especially for anyone who lived through those turbulent times.
So it's not just about what Russia's doing right now. It's also about all that baggage that comes with it. The echoes of past traumas that come back up in times of global uncertainty.
Right. And given this idea that the U.S. is abandoning its allies and that Russia is becoming more assertive, well, that's when Jackowski's call for Polish unity and patriotism really starts to hit home. He's essentially saying that Poland can only rely on itself in this rapidly changing world.
It's a message that appeals to national pride, but it also kind of stokes those fears of external threats. It's like he's saying, hey, Poland, you're surrounded by all these crocodiles, and the only way you're going to survive is if you're strong and united and ready to fight.
Exactly. And that narrative is probably going to resonate with people who are, disillusioned by the promises of globalism and who think that a return to a strong national identity is the only way to guarantee security and autonomy. It really taps into an us versus them mentality where Poland has to put its own interests first no matter what.
But couldn't that also lead to isolationism, like a retreat from international cooperation and dialogue? How does Jackowski balance this call for self-reliance with Poland's need to engage with the rest of the world, especially being part of the EU?
That's a really important question. And to be honest, it's not one that Jackowski fully answers. His vision seems to be laser-focused on all the potential threats facing Poland, without really offering any concrete solutions for how to navigate this really complex geopolitical landscape.
So while he's pointing out the anxieties and challenges, he's not really providing a roadmap for action. It's more about, raising the alarm, urging his audience to embrace this idea of Polish self-reliance as a way to survive.
Exactly. And it leaves us and his listeners, I think, with a lot to think about. Like, what does this self-reliance actually look like in the real world? How does Poland balance its own national interests with its commitments to the EU and its relationships with other countries?
It's a very delicate balancing act and one that requires a lot of careful consideration. Jackowski's predictions may not offer any clear solutions, but they definitely highlight all the anxieties and uncertainties that Poland and probably many other nations are grappling with as the global power dynamics continue to shift.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we need to move beyond just summarizing predictions. It really dig into the reasons behind them. These anxieties, these fears are rooted in historical experience, cultural narratives, and a really deep desire for security and autonomy.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not just, analyzing some predictions, we're actually exploring the emotions and beliefs that shape how people view the world.
Right. And by understanding these perspectives, even the ones we might not agree with, we can start to get a much more nuanced understanding of what's driving global events and all the anxieties that go along with them.
So moving beyond this sense of powerlessness that Jackowski kind of presents, what concrete steps could Poland actually take to assert itself and navigate this changing world order? Like, what are their options?
That's a great question. One option is to strengthen its ties within the EU and really leverage the power of the bloc to counterbalance the influence of both Russia and the US.
That makes sense. Strengthen numbers, and the EU gives Poland a platform to project its interests on the global stage.
Right. But there's also the option of pursuing a more independent path, forging strategic alliances with other countries that share similar concerns about Russian aggression, or maybe U.S. unilateralism.
So kind of like a third way navigating between these major power blocks and finding partners based on shared interests and values.
Exactly. And that path might involve things like strengthening its own military capabilities, diversifying its economic partnerships, and building stronger ties with countries in Central and Eastern Europe who share that similar history with Russia.
So it's not just about picking sides, it's about figuring out how to strategically position itself within the global system to, maximize its autonomy and security.
Exactly. And that's where Jackowski's emphasis on national unity and purpose becomes really important. If Poland wants to assert itself on the world stage, it needs a clear vision, a strong sense of internal cohesion, and the willingness to make some tough choices.
I think that's a key takeaway from this deep dive. It's not just about predicting the future, it's about understanding the forces that are shaping it and figuring out the potential paths forward. It's about empowering ourselves, and in this case, empowering Poland to make informed decisions and really take control of its own destiny.
Well said. And that empowerment starts with understanding those anxieties, acknowledging the historical context, and exploring the full range of options available.
So as we head into the last part of this deep dive, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how Jackowski's predictions might be received by different groups in Polish society. Who's likely to connect with this message and who might push back against his worldview?
That's a really insightful question and definitely one we should explore further. I think it's safe to say that those who are already worried about Russia, those who feel disillusioned by the West, and those who really value a strong sense of Polish national identity are probably going to find his predictions very compelling.
Right. It seems like his message would play into those existing anxieties and maybe even, fuel some nationalist feelings. But what about those who see Poland's future as more aligned with the EU or the US? How might they react?
I imagine they'd be a lot more skeptical, maybe even critical of his emphasis on self-reliance and the way he portrays Poland as this victim of bigger powers. They might say that he's overlooking the benefits of international cooperation and the importance of staying close to other democratic nations.
So there's a chance for division, a clash between those who see Poland's future as more independent and those who think global engagement and collaboration are more important.
Right. And that tension really reflects a broader debate that's happening not just in Poland, but in many countries all over the world. It's this debate about the balance between national sovereignty and global interconnectedness, self-reliance versus collective action.
And it's a debate that's only going to get more intense as the world becomes more complex and unpredictable.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to have these conversations, to explore these different viewpoints, and to try to find some common ground, even when there are disagreements.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to acknowledge that Jackowski's predictions, whether they're right or wrong, have started a conversation about Poland's place in the world, its anxieties, its hopes, and its potential paths forward.
Yeah. And that conversation is important, even if it gets a little uncomfortable. It forces us to confront these really tough questions, to grapple with complex realities, and to look for solutions that address these very real anxieties and, hopefully help shape a more secure and prosperous future for Poland.
And with that in mind, let's move on to the final part of this deep dive and see what other insights we can find in Jackowski's vision and all the discussions it has sparked. So, as we're going through all these different viewpoints, I keep thinking back to Jackowski's claim that America has basically, lost the war with Russia. It's such a strong statement, and I just wonder how you interpret that.
Yeah, it's definitely one of his most provocative claims, and it's really important to be critical. when we think about it. I wouldn't go so far as to say America has lost,
Right.
like in a total sense, but there's no question that Russia has been making some serious geopolitical moves these last few years.
Right. And Joukowsky seems to be picking up on this feeling of unease, maybe even fear that the U.S. is stepping back from being a global leader, and that's leaving countries like Poland feeling vulnerable.
Exactly. And that's where his crocodiles on the loose metaphor really hits hard. It plays on that very primal fear of these powerful predatory forces just waiting to take advantage of any weakness.
It's like he's saying to Poland, don't count on the U.S. to protect you. They're pulling back and you're on your own.
Yes, and that message can be especially powerful for anyone who remembers the Cold War. When the Poland was basically under Soviet control. It brings up all those memories of trauma and makes people wonder if history is just going to repeat itself.
But it's not just about Russia, right? Jackowski also suggests that Trump might use Poland as a bargaining chip in negotiations, and he even goes as far as to say that Trump could break Poland.
That's right. And that prediction, more than any other, I think really shows the anxiety that comes with being a smaller nation stuck between these huge powers. It raises questions about how much alliances can really do and whether smaller countries will always end up being used for the benefit of their stronger partners.
And this anxiety is even worse because he mentions Act 447, the U.S. law about Holocaust restitution. He seems to be implying that this could be used as leverage against Poland, and it just adds to this feeling of being vulnerable and taken advantage of.
Absolutely. And we have to remember that Act 447 is a really sensitive issue in Poland. It's already caused some tension between the two countries. So when Jarkowski says it could be used as a bargaining chip, well, it's likely to make those tensions even worse and, increase that resentment towards the U.S.
So we're seeing this pattern here, right? This sense of Poland being squeezed from all sides, pressure from Russia, uncertainty about the U.S., and even the possibility of being exploited by its own allies. It's a pretty grim picture, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that these anxieties, even though they might be exaggerated by Joukowski's predictions, they are coming from real events and Poland's own history. I mean, the country has a really long history of being caught in the middle of conflicts, of being invaded and divided and controlled by stronger neighbors.
Okay, so these anxieties aren't just made up. They're based on a very real and very often painful past.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the historical context is so crucial when we look at Joukowski's predictions. They might seem totally crazy to some people, but to a lot of Poles, they tap into these deep collective memories and a very real sense of vulnerability.
But even with all this negativity, Joukowski does offer some hope, right? He talks about the importance of Polish patriotism and self-reliance, and he suggests that having a strong national identity is how they'll get through these difficult times.
Yes, and this is where his message is kind of both appealing and maybe a little risky. On the one hand, it's this call for unity, a reminder of how strong and resilient Poland has been in the past. It connects with a sense of national pride and this determination to make their own choices.
Right. It's about taking back control, refusing to just be a pawn in someone else's game. But then couldn't this focus on national identity also make them more inward-looking and isolated?
That's the risk, and it's something we need to be really careful about. While having a strong national identity can be a good thing, it can also be used to justify policies that exclude people or to encourage hostility towards anyone who's different.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It's about finding that sweet spot between a healthy amount of national pride and being open to the rest of the world, being willing to cooperate with other countries.
Exactly. And this is where the conversation needs to move beyond just what Jackowski is predicting. It needs to address what Polish identity means in the 21st century and the challenge of balancing national interests with being part of a global community.
So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions, right? Is Poland really in danger of being broken, like Joukowski says? Is the U.S. really leaving its allies to deal with Russia on their own? And how can Poland make sure it's safe and successful in a world that's this uncertain?
Those are really important questions, and they need a lot of careful thought and analysis. Joukowski's predictions, while they are attention-grabbing, should be seen as a starting point for a much deeper conversation about Poland's place in the world, its fears, and its hopes for the future.
And in the end, it's up to the Polish people to decide what kind of future they want to build for themselves.
Absolutely. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think there's one main takeaway that applies to everyone, not just Poland, especially in these uncertain times. And that's the importance of thinking critically, questioning what we believe, and listening to different perspectives.
It's about not falling for easy answers or simple stories, and instead really trying to understand how complex the world actually is.
Exactly. And if we can do that, we'll be better equipped to deal with whatever challenges come our way, to make smart choices, and to help create a world that's more peaceful, fair, and sustainable.
Thanks so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's given us a lot to consider.
It was my pleasure. And to all our listeners, I encourage you to keep exploring these issues, keep having these important conversations, and never be afraid to ask questions.
And as always, we want to hear what you think. Share your thoughts and ideas on social media using the hashtag #DeepDivePodcast. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring.